Hello everyone, this is a presentation of the Manhattan Project Historical Park. We will discuss the history, importance, and economics of this amazing park. First, let's talk about the park itself. Where is it? The park is very unique because it has three locations across the US. These include Hanford, Washington, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Los Alamos, New Mexico. What does the park look like? These two photos are from Hanford, Washington. The building is called the B reactor and is where plutonium was produced. The above image was taken in 1944, and the one below was taken in 2015. Let's talk about the historical context of this site. According to History.com, the Manhattan Project was the code name for the American led effort to develop a functioning atomic weapon during World War II. It started in 1942 and was first based in Manhattan. However, in December of 1942, President Roosevelt combined three major research and production facilities to form a single effort called the Manhattan Project. These three locations are in New Mexico, Tennessee, and Washington, and each location had a specific responsibility. In Hanford, Washington, this site was responsible for producing plutonium, which is a key material used in atomic bombs. The Columbian River ran through Hanford and was used to generate power and cool the reactors. The plutonium produced at this site was used in the bombs for the Trinity test and the bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, they produced another key material used in atomic bombs, uranium. Uranium was enriched in several facilities part of the Manhattan Project. This location was perfect because it had many trees and hills, which kept it a secret from enemies and the general public. Los Alamos, New Mexico is where everything came together. The first nuclear bombs were tested here. Plutonium from Hanford and uranium from Oak Ridge was sent to Los Alamos, where research facilities and testing grounds were located. On July 16, 1945, the first nuclear device was tested 210 miles south of Los Alamos, New Mexico. Now let's look at some of the key national and international events that led to the creation of the atomic bomb. Nuclear fission is the key reaction when making a nuclear explosion. This, of course, sparked the interest of the government when in 1939 Albert Einstein presented the idea of a fission chain reaction. This was when the government began funding research on atomic energy and bombs. Now that the government was funding the nuclear program, they began looking for sources of plutonium and uranium, which would be later produced in Hanford and Oak Ridge. Eventually, the two production facilities and Los Alamos were joined into one team to produce and manufacture nuclear bombs. Finally, on July 16, 1945, the first nuclear bomb was successfully tested. Internationally, it all begins in World War II and Europe is plunged into another world war, but the US remains neutral. That all changed in December 1941 when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and the next day the United States declared war on Japan and joined the Allied powers. Eventually, Germany would surrender on May 7, 1945, leaving only the US and Japan at war. To stop the war, the United States nuked Nagasaki and Hiroshima. To this day, it is the only time nukes have ever been used in war.
All right, welcome everyone to part 2 of the Manhattan Project National Historic Park presentation. So why is this park so important? Well, the advent of nuclear weapons had a profound impact on human history. Not only did they bring an end to World War II, they also ushered in the atomic age and the Cold War, which would define world history and politics for the century to come and perhaps even beyond. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought a swift end to the war. Fighting had ended in Europe months before with Germany's surrender on May 8th, but the war wasn't truly over until Japan signed surrender documents on September 2nd. The decision to use the bombs in the first place was justified by the frankly staggering loss of life on both the Allied and Japanese sides of the Pacific theater. Unfortunately, the effects on the Japanese population, both initial and long-term, were devastating. Estimates of the death toll vary due to the damage and disruption of the war at the time, and the truth will probably never be truly known. What is certain is that hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives initially, and many more dealt with serious injuries and radiation poisoning. It also took a major psychological toll on the country. Nuclear fears have had a far-reaching impact on Japan in the years since. This societal anxiety was unfortunately exacerbated by the ongoing threat of nuclear annihilation during the Cold War. Here's a basic timeline of the Cold War. From 1945 to 1991, world history practically was the Cold War. Many different major historical events, the Red Scare, the wars in Korea and Vietnam, the space race, the Cuban Missile Crisis, so on, were reflections of the rivalry between the two global superpowers. The United States with capitalism and democracy versus the Soviet Union with communism. The reason that these two nations fought each other with containment, competition, and proxy wars was mutually assured destruction. Both countries knew that the other was capable of launching nuclear weapons, but if even one weapon was launched, it was already over. The enemy would respond swiftly in kind. Anyone paying any attention to the world stage was painfully aware of the devastation that would soon follow, a global nuclear winter. Paradoxically, the existence of nuclear weapons were a successful deterrence from their use on their own. Here's a more positive and peaceful outcome of the Manhattan Project, the development of nuclear energy. It is controversial even today, thanks in no small part to some notorious disasters. These images here on the right are of the Elephant's Foot at Chernobyl, which is so radioactive it distorts film, and of the residential area near Fukushima, which is still evacuated and now overgrown. That last one on the list, at 3 Mile Island, especially damaged the faith of the American public in nuclear power, and it never quite recovered. Still, nuclear energy is typically safe. The problem is that the disasters it does cause create the worst sort of headlines. And anyway, here's the economic significance. As previously stated, nuclear power and its implications have shaped the history of the world since their first use. Naturally, this extends to the economy. The civilian nuclear power industry is a fairly sizable force in the economy. It provides jobs to millions of people in the U.S. and contributes to about $60 billion of the U.S. domestic gross each year. It also provides us with a reliable source of electricity, allowing us to diversify and secure our energy supply. Nuclear power plants are very expensive and difficult to build, though they will usually eventually pay for themselves. According to the World Nuclear Association, nuclear energy now provides about 10% of the world's electricity and acts as the second largest source of low-carbon power. In a time of growing concern about the impact of carbon on the climate and the world's future, this is invaluable. On to the negatives. During the Cold War, the U.S. spent a lot of money on nuclear arms. Quote, from 1940 through 1996, we spent nearly $5.5 trillion on nuclear weapons and weapons-related programs in constant 1996 dollars. That's from Schwartz, 1998. It was considered a necessity as the alternative was military vulnerability. That was still a sizable portion of the United States budget that was going into a market that would, by nature, never pay it back. And naturally, the Cold War itself impacted the economy. Ongoing tensions led to inflation in America by the 1970s. This led to President Reagan supporting supply-side economics, more commonly now known as trickle-down economics, which involves tax cuts and incentives for wealthy people and corporations in the hopes that they will boost the whole economy. This is now known to many as simply Reaganomics. In the UK at the time, Margaret Thatcher was instituting similar policies. Some remember these fondly, while others certainly do not. And now, why should you care? Today, these sites act as both a preservation of knowledge and as a warning against its misuse. The scientific advancement that happened here is incredible and should not be understated. At the same time, though, we cannot ignore the horrors it caused. Even those involved at the time knew that this would change the world forever. This quote is Oppenheimer reminiscing on the brief time after the first successful testing on July 16th. We knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed, a few people cried, most people were silent. He also paraphrased a quote from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, excuse my pronunciation, into, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. And even now, the innate contradictions of nuclear power still capture the mind of the public through pop culture. For instance, the 2019 HBO series Chernobyl was a retelling of the story of the meltdown of Chernobyl, focusing on the consequences of government cover-up and lying. The upcoming Christopher Nolan film Oppenheimer will be a biographical film about J. Robert Oppenheimer himself, releasing this July. And in the realm of fiction, in Japan, Godzilla's initial movie, released in 1954, was an allegory for the terror and destruction of nuclear power. This would have been unfortunately very familiar for audiences at the time. And in America, particularly in the comic book industry, the strange and exciting new science of radioactivity was often used to power heroes and villains alike. For example, here are DC's Atomic Man as well as Marvel's Spider-Man. The one piece of information that I would pass on is to treasure life while you still have it. If there's one thing learning about this park has taught me, it is that life is fragile. During the Cold War, there were quite a few incidents where if things went just a little differently, most of us would not have had a chance to be born. And that sounds grim, and it is. But I prefer to think of it as a reason to keep going and a reason